We don't need more beat makers, fruity loopers, people who just throw loops together, call themselves musicians. We need you to stop making beats and pick up a real instrument, learn music theory, learn how to play it. Otherwise, you're just a fraud. I hear that narrative a couple times a week. I get told myself to stop making beats because I'm a fraud who's never picked up an instrument. Forget the fact that I've shown videos of myself playing beats from scratch and not using loops and composing loops, and the fact that I was classically trained in a couple instruments. Who cares, right? Facts don't matter. This is YouTube. But this prevailing narrative that beat makers are not real musicians because they don't play real instruments, traditional instruments, and don't learn music theory is absolutely something that is pervasive. You're going to hear it a lot, which is interesting, you know, because if you're that vehement about music, then maybe you would have studied great musicians who didn't understand music theory, great musicians who created entire genres without formal training, such as rap music, such as house music. Maybe you've studied the outsider music phenomenon. I mean, all those things are really interesting, but usually the people who are angry about us just living our lives and making beats the way we want them to sound never take the time to research or investigate all of the subjects they claim to be experts on. So let's try something out. Let's make a beat without any music theory. First of all, what is music theory? So at its core, music theory, according to Levine Music, is notes and scales, rhythm and meter, melody and form, chords and harmony. Okay, pretty basic stuff. Us producers can barely read, so these are letters that form words. We'll talk about that in another video. We don't understand any of that stuff, so I'm just going to open my DAW. I'm not going to change the project tempo. I'm not going to mess with the time signature because I don't know what either of those things are. Those are part of music theory. And because I don't know what a downbeat is, I'm just going to start painting in sounds. These are drum sounds. I don't know anything about sound selection because that comes from ear training and experience, so I'm just going to do whatever. Yeah, this should be good. And because most of us beat makers rely entirely on loops, I'm just gonna go into Splice and drag in something I think sounds cool. Beautiful. Now I'm going to add an instrument, a MIDI instrument, but I can't play instruments, so I'm just going to use these two fingers and play something. I don't know what scale I'm in. What is a scale, right? Pretty good beat, right? Now, of course, the producers that people claim are trash because they don't understand music theory are the producers that they're familiar with. So in other words, producers who have hit songs, who have #1 records, who have popular music, they obviously don't make beats that sound like this. But the reality of the situation is, even a producer that doesn't have a formal understanding of music theory, who has never been trained, who has never taken lessons, has a strong foundational concept of all of these concepts within music theory. If someone can put 3 loops together that sound good, they are demonstrating, at least on a basic level, a understanding of music theory. Because for those 3 loops to work together, you have to know scales, you have to know tempo, you have to know rhythm, you have to know all of that stuff. Notes and scales, rhythm and meter. These two, maybe, depending on how many layers you actually add, but you at least are checking these 2 boxes. I was surprised to learn that a lot of great musicians, Elton John, for example, one of the greatest songwriters, and I haven't seen the biopic Rocket Man, but apparently he is self-taught, so he never had formal training. Jazz legend, self-taught also. Prince, self-taught. I mean, and you can say, all right, well, these guys intuitively know music theory. Jimi Hendrix, for example, they can all play instruments, sure, but there are many ways to demonstrate proficiency. So, for example, and we learned this in the School of Education, students who have trouble with essays may have less trouble with an oral exam. People who have trouble with oral exams may have less trouble with a Scantron exam. There are many different ways to assess proficiency in a subject. And so with music theory, it's not always just a matter of someone being able to explain what a diminished chord is or being able to explain counterpoint. If they can use both of those concepts in music intuitively, they don't necessarily need to explain it on paper. And so when people come at producers, generally hip-hop beat makers, wonder why, right? It comes from a place of hubris, elitism, but ultimately a flawed foundation. So it's oftentimes just the classic case of somebody trying so hard to sound smart that they actually end up looking stupid without even realizing it, because intelligence comes with self-awareness. We had a conversation a little bit about this. My brother Dames, said something about Fruity Loopers and music theory, so I had to push back a little. Drop a comment if you know of any great producers or musicians who don't know formal music theory. I want to learn about them too. I think this is all interesting. Producers, make the music you love. There's nothing wrong with making music without understanding formal music theory. Some of the greatest music producers don't know music theory in a traditional sense, but they know it inside of them intuitively, and they can therefore make amazing music. But learn music theory, learn an instrument. I think all of these tools will make us better musicians overall, and at very least, if we're collaborating with other musicians, it gives us a vocabulary to communicate our ideas and make us better collaborators. But don't get discouraged, don't get down on yourself because of what some jerk on the internet says.
I mean, this is pretty much the same conversation that we've had about producers or whether or not they should actually learn music or not, right? Like, yeah, you could potentially, roll the dice and just be on Fruity Loops and put some stuff together and then it can work. But if you actually know music, you actually, when you do get something that works, you have a better understanding of how it works. So you have a higher chance of recreating that again and again, and you have more control over how your sound evolves. I think oftentimes, but that takes work, right? Like actually learning music and like why things that actually takes work. So you might see a producer that does understand all that and it has consistent momentum. Let's just say, 5 out of every 10 songs does well. But then you have somebody else that has a big song, but didn't really know how they created it. And then they hit like 1 out of 100. Somebody looking at both of them will be like, well, it can still happen. So I'm going to try the 1 out of 100 because it can still happen because they just don't want to do the work. So I think a lot of songwriters saying that don't really want to understand what Tehran is talking about. And I don't know if he shares what some of this sauce or some of this formula is. But I've heard a lot of people, not a lot, I've heard a few different like legendary hit makers talk about like the formula of a hit. I've never heard them describe what it is. Um, but, it sounds like you can get to that conversation if you network and know the right folks. So
I definitely have heard people describe the formula too, especially depending on the genre. Like I know like in gospel, there's certain chords in a chord progression that's almost like you can look at the top 3 chord progressions in gospel music or Christian music specifically that work with like worship tracks, or you can go into like a pop track and the things that they encompass, or even song structure. So I think it's a lot of times genre specific. I know Quincy Jones, like I have a friend who's a producer and he's incredible. I was with him a couple of days ago and he was kind of telling me, we were in a room and he was recording the room sound and he was like, oh, I got you on a track. Like 2 hours later, I was like, what? And he was like, yeah, I quantized it and he basically put our conversations in the room noise on the keypad and was talking about how the frequency of the room felt good for a certain type of song he was producing. And I was like, this is wild. But he used to, before Quincy passed, I won't say he was mentored by Quincy Jones, but he was mentored by somebody who was in Quincy's world, and he said that he spent a lot of time with them, and one thing that Quincy Jones was very emphatic about was like figuring out which frequency they were trying. And I know a lot of people are about to be like, what? But like songs in the key of life is actually like if you look at the key that they did that album in with Stevie Wonder, it's the key of birth, right? Which is wild. Like you can do a lot of like studying around it, but he started breaking it down for me. And he said, that's why the album feels so good to us, because it's the same key that birth happens in. And then he told me about the science behind it, whatever. But he was like, Quincy Jones is very like into this. Like, what key should this be in? Because we're conveying this thing. And that's how he would always start with a conversation and they would build around that. And then they would choose the instruments and the sounds. And I was like in awe of this conversation. So like, again, I'm with you, Dame. I don't necessarily know all the technicalities around it, especially because, again, I'm not a producer. I don't make music, but hearing from the experts and the people who do this for a living and very regularly, it's way more formula. It's almost like you have to have the formula in order for you to consistently produce it well. Otherwise, like you said, it's just shots in the dark and you're hoping that you land on something. I think it's a shot in the dark anyways, but there's a level, it's like putting up shots literally. Like if your form is the same for every shot and you're putting up 1,000 shots a day, if you move that to 10,000 shots a day, naturally your form is going to continue to improve and the amount of shots that you make is going to go up because you're taking more shots. But it still requires the formula of getting your feet placed right, getting your hips to swing, jumping at the same time, releasing at the same time. It's all those steps that happen.
Okay, so to go back to what Dane was saying, I honestly think, because I swear I've seen it, and I can name producers that I've known that have become massive hit makers with insane success records, people who have hit after hit after hit. I mean, maybe they weren't telling me the whole story, or maybe they were grappling with it internally, but a lot of them were just kids who got Fruity Loops, and I don't know, they just naturally they spoke the language naturally. You know how some people just know language? They can just walk into a new country and they learn the language damn near fluently within a month.
I have a friend who can do that.
It's just something that's in them. And I feel like there's something that's in certain music producers, songwriters, any kind of musician. I've seen it with singer-songwriters too, where they can't explain it, but they figure it out. The same way, you might look at a native English speaker. This has actually been studied. Ask a native English speaker, even us, not me because I went to school for this, but like anyone that's well-spoken, and say, hey, can you break down the syntax of the last sentence? They're going to be like, what the hell are you talking about? But that's the math of language. So the same way you might hear someone make an amazing beat and you're like, hey, what progression was that? Was that 1-5-6, or was that a diminished chord at the end? Or they're going to look at you like you're crazy because they haven't systematized it yet in a overt way, but in their minds, they can sit down and subconsciously create it. I think, especially when it comes to music, and to use Tehran's word, the magic isn't as elusive as we think, but as long as we choose not to try to explain it, then it will always just remain this covert magic. And with him, he's making it overt magic. He's explaining the system. He could probably write down his approach step by step. You know what I mean? Same way with like a person on YouTube. They might not be an amazing producer. You'll watch YouTube videos where someone's like, this is the secret behind pop chords. They don't have any hit records, but they can explain the whole thing. And then there might be someone with a hit record that would never be able to explain that, gun to their heads. Music is magical. We don't know we know what's going on, and we don't know what's going on, and then amazing things happen.